Are there any of those who want to speak? I'll just wait for them to get the cup of tea on. We'll just check while we're waiting. Who's next? Is it Mr. Reid? Right, okay, I can't see everybody's nameplate because of people. So we've got Mr. Reid, Mr. Burns, and Mr. Molyneux. Are you together? Yeah, okay. Mr. Reid until everybody's sat back down so they can hear. Okay, I think most people are either back of their seat or can hear what's being said, so we'll carry on. So if we start with Mr. Reid.
Thank you very much. Can I deal with, I should say, represent Bradford Real Estate Limited. I've got 2 points, one relating to housing numbers, the second one to the basis of approach. The housing numbers aspect, of course, part 2 of SB2 identified that around 30,800 new dwellings will be delivered over the planned period. And that 30,800 was purportedly, well in fact was, developed on the basis of a high growth strategy. And you'll be able to see that, Mrs. Crosby, within the issues and strategic options consultation document EV 003.01, catchy reference, page 14 to 20. And it says that at the annual rates that are identified within that document, this was a high growth option. Now, of course, you know that the ABCA provision, or rather the BCA provision, of 1,500 dwellings is to be incorporated within the 30,800. And that, when one calculates the annual result, when one looks at what the effect of removing 1,500 from the 30,800 is, it drops the growth strategy to a moderate growth. And so the adoption of, or rather the accounting exercise, which effectively it is, what we say is a sleight of hand, leads to a fundamental shift in the growth option that has been adopted by the Council. And of course, if what the authority wants to do is maintain its current strategy, it should be seeking provision over and above the 30,800 in order to accommodate the BCA needs. That's our first point on this issue, at least. The second point is one of approach, and of course has been said that, and correctly said, in terms of how it's been described in the plan, that there's an urban focus towards the strategy. But it is an urban focus that incorporates a particular element, namely the delivery of strategic settlements, which, once developed, of course, will fit within that overall strategy. And those strategic settlements are designed within the plan strategy to follow and to reflect the need for a step change in economic expansion and progress. And that is actually simply for Shropshire at the moment, but one that requires a tying into the wider economic region. And one can see that identified in numerous reports, both within the Shropshire purview and outside of it, namely the remaining areas of Black Country, if nothing else. But the second report, for example, within Shropshire identifies that, and the plan identifies it. See paragraphs 3.117, the written statement, to 3.121. And that step change will require proper development. And what this plan doesn't do and certainly the strategy doesn't do, is deliver correctly sufficient appropriate sites in order to achieve that step change. And it's something that we'll return to in the context of other policies and other questions as and when. But that is clear simply on the basis of the Shropshire position and doesn't actually take into account the further requirements for the BCA. And when one factors those in, one can see that the appropriate levels of development, particularly in the east of Shropshire, on the M54 corridor, in those areas there should be proper provision and isn't. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Reid. The Council want to respond on that point. Mr. Corden?
Yeah, thank you, Mrs. Crosby. With specific regard to the requirements, the first point I'd make is, of course, this net ceiling. I think that's an important point. In terms of the Black Country contribution, it's correct that the intention is to incorporate the housing requirements. When we were undertaking the discussions, in terms of the contribution, we reflect on our strategy, and it was very much complementary to that strategy. There are a number of opportunities that we'd identified for proposals for they've documented in the explanation to SP2, paragraph was the case another fact ones, isn't it? 3.6, apologies. We very much feel in accommodating proportion of the unmet need from the Black Country. We contribute to a number of those aspirations, things like increasing the delivery of family housing, supporting family commitment structure, supporting the supporting wide operations to include increased productivity. So we don't much further complementary. It remains a high level of growth. With flexibility to respond to changes to the open need of the platform, and also to contribute to those opportunities that with specific distribution of development, I think I've had discussed previously. I think we feel we've struck the distribution in doing that. With regard to strategic sectors, we consider the proposals for those they're considering the relevant settlement policies, which is 19 to 21.
Thank you, Mr. Corden. Come along now to whoever was next. It was Mulliner. Thank you, Ma'am. Sorry, I missed Mr. Burns and Mrs.
So I'm fighting for room here. Mrs. Crosby, I'm also losing the battle for room. Just picking up the point made by Mr. Young about the figure of 37 homes per hectare of employment land in Bridgnorth. He's allowed me to get which I appreciate. Based on the 49 hectares of employment land set out in policy S3. However, all the specific circumstances in Bridgnorth in relation to the existing employment sites and those saved employment sites. This is picked up in the Shropshire Council Employment Strategy topic paper, which is GC4M. Table 4 of that, which is on page 14, relevant to Bridgnorth. That does the actual delivery of employment land in Bridgnorth will be 39.2 hectares, rather than the 49 hectare figure that's actually presented in policy S3. And is for later discussions in the hearing sessions around policy S3. Because that results, if you take into account that 39 hectare figure, which allows for, I understand, things like the loss of the site and the market site being relocated within the Sandev site. If you use that 39.2 hectare figure, the adjustment housing and employment results in 46 houses per 1 hectare of employment.
Are you speaking in support of the policy, or are you seeking a change? Or?
You've got here, so and I speak about specific wording about S3, but I just didn't leave you with a note of 37 homes per hectare without correcting that.
Does the council want to come back on that point?
Mr. Burns is correct, Ma'am. The overall supply identified in the policy is 49 hectares, but that includes some local proposals where there will be a relocation of the use and the extinguishment of the existing site for that use. So the land is there, but it's simply a swapping from one location to another. And that does reduce the actual provision from 49 to 39.
Right.
So the amount of new land is limited to, is a small amount?
Yes.
Yeah.
And mate, obviously we'll get onto this later on in the examination, but if it was so required that there would need to be a modification to clarify that within the policy to reflect that position, the council would be open to accommodating that.
Thank you, Mr. West. So sorry, Miss.
Thank you, Ma'am. Jacqueline Mulliner here from Terence O'Rourke representing Harrow Estates. There's clearly a number of themes at play here, but I note the starting point in the strategic approach, SP2, is to make the settlements more sustainable. And to that end, there have been a number of important allocations to do this, including the net 15 hectares allocated for employment provision at Shifnal to achieve or help achieve a greater sustainability and self-containment of that settlement. So there is some rebalancing that is going on. It's not just a case of matching jobs for new jobs and new homes. There is some rebalance. But alongside that, the theme is also very clearly a step change, and that's how the council has described it, from rural to urban focus. So beyond that initial starting point of rebalancing, there are further opportunities to explore to deliver the step change. And I do mention Shifnal here because something has been said about it already around the table. It is the largest key centre within the county. Plus, there is clearly a very high demand for employment and housing within the settlement. There has been recent release, which again has been a rebalancing, but also these releases have been made on the back of a 5-year housing land supply shortfall and in the context of sustainable development. It's not as if those releases have been unsustainable. They have been sustainable at Shifnal. And I think the point here is that it's how do you gain that full and proper step change from rural to urban focus beyond the initial rebalancing point. And it's those opportunities that I think that we will explore further down the line, obviously, but to make the point now that it's not so much what's wrong with this policy, it's then how this policy works its way through in terms of the allocations that have made and the distribution of growth that's been made. Thank you.
Thank you. Do the council want to address?
Okay. Yes, thank you, Inspector Crosby. Just come back on a point made there about step change and the term about that. Just to clarify, just think really, which will hopefully be helpful. That is referenced in the context of the economic growth aspirations of the council, not necessarily not within the context of the change from a rural to an urban agenda in terms of the strategy. So just a minor point there from what the lady just mentioned there. Okay.
Thank you. So we've been on the two. I said we'd just go around and let everybody say, hopefully everybody's had the opportunity to speak. Given that the council obviously had the opportunity to have the final word, is there anything you want to say before we move on to the next question? No? Okay, thank you. So question 4 on the agenda says whether policy SP2 should set out how much employment land / how many homes are being allocated to meet the unmet need of the Black Country. So there were some comments came through statements that the policy SP2 should be specifically deal with this matter. I'll come to you if I ask the council to comment first on its thoughts on this. So it seems like hopefully shouldn't take too long, I don't think.
Yes, I don't want to use examination resource on this one particularly, but I would say that our position is that we don't feel as though it's necessary to include that specific reference within the policy. We've made clear our approach to the accommodation of the unmet need within the wider housing requirement. So it is an element of that, but not. I don't think it's necessary to draw that out within policy. It is referenced within the explanatory text at paragraph 310 and 318, which we think is sufficient to draw out the explanation around the policy.
Thank you. And we'll probably come back to that when we look at things like monitoring and whether that's sufficient to deal with that. Mr. Urban.
I do apologise. Sorry, I do apologise, ma'am. I didn't introduce myself when we spoke last, but I'm representing Much Wenlock Town Council and Associates, which is the Much Wenlock Neighbourhood Plan Refresh Group. So the question 4, the unmet needs of the Black Country, there was no mention in the Much Wenlock and surrounding area place plan of Much Wenlock being a suitable town to sit along a straight...
Sorry, this question is a very specific question about whether the actual policy should set out the amount that the council are seeking to meet, rather than the sort of principle of whether that need should be met.
So the point that I would like to make about 1,000 houses at Tasley, 200 at Much Wenlock and 500 at Buildwas are along an unsuitable strategic corridor. It's not very clear.
No, what we'll do with those specific site issues or applications, we'll deal with those at stage 2. So,
or perhaps I can continue on question 21 on the same issue. Is that correct?
Yeah, 21 is off the top of my head, but...
This policy SP14 is justified, effective and consistent, which is strategic corridors. It's an important point for Much Wenlock.
Well, before we get to that particular question, we've obviously got a lot to get through, but we have some specific comments about specific applications, which are stage.
The comment is about the suitability of a strategic corridor in this locale.
Right. And then next week, I think, I don't know, Mr. Tyler mentioned, that we'll deal with infrastructure as well next week. So if it's about infrastructure, then that's another matter. It's difficult because they are meshed together.
Yes, I think it's the word strategic which actually drew my attention. It's a strategic corridor for development.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else want to comment on this particular district question? Sorry, can I just see in there? It sounds horrible shouting out the number, doesn't it? Mr. Covey. Sounds like something.
Yeah, so 3,000, wasn't it? Yeah. It's a fairly one, isn't it? And I think that the budgetary authorities have got an open mind. I think we agree with Mr. West that the basis for the housing figure is set out in the justification to the policy, and the 1,500 to me needs arising in the country is referenced in the plan. So reading the plan as a whole, we don't see any real benefit in including that within the policy itself.
Thank you. Mr. Roberts.
Thank you. It's just a matter of confirmation, really. So, my name is Clive Roberts. I'm appearing here for the Save Bridge North Greenbelt Group and the Hobbins Management Company. We are going to object, and we'll hear more about this next week in employment needs and the Greenbelt, to two sites that are currently allocated for employment development at Stanmore. The sites are STC 002 and P58A. I was really picking up on what Mr. West said, that the Black Country figures have been swallowed into the county figures, and I was just wondering if any part of the need to accommodate that 1,500 houses and in particular 30 hectares of employment land, if the fact that they were necessary for the Black Country need had influenced in any way the location and distribution of those additional figures.
Do you want to just turn your microphone off and then it picks up something? I think my understanding is the number of applications, for example, haven't changed since the council agreed to meet this unmet need for the Black Country authorities. So in that regard, they've not been put in specific areas because there's no specific allocations relating to it. That's my understanding.
That is completely that's accurate. In terms of our approach, we haven't identified any specific locations, but what we have said, there are more obvious locations in proximity to the West Midlands in terms of the ABCA area, which would lend themselves to accommodating that unmet need in a sustainable manner, particularly Bridge North being one of those.
Thank you. Does that explain the situation?
Should we be dealing with this in a little more detail next?
Yeah, this question is really about the wording of the policy. The wording of the policy should include a number. So, okay.
That's fine. Thank you.
I can't see anybody else. Oh, Mr. Reid.
Thank you. Just very briefly, if I can. We think that it should include. Thank you very much. We think it should include the figure because whilst we disagree with the amount of that figure, at least it requires, or at least it will then have the force of policy as opposed to simply being included in a written statement. And it allows one subsequently to understand the degree to which the BCA needs still exists within the area.
The council want to come back on any of those points? It's clearly a matter of opinion, isn't it? But,
I think it is a matter of opinion. Our opinion is there is sufficient explanation within the explanatory text and within the statements of common ground that has been signed by the authority and all of the ABCA leaders to be able to I suppose reflect upon that unmet need and how it's been addressed. So we continue to think that it shouldn't be included in the policy itself. So yeah, it's a difference of opinion, I would say, on that.
yeah. And for the benefit of people here that have not been here at previous days, what we've said is we won't necessarily pronounce on these things ourselves in the hearings. We'll go away and produce a letter following these 2 weeks of hearings that will set out our thoughts on various matters that have been discussed. And at an earlier stage, there was an issue arose yesterday in terms of duty to cooperate. And in terms of the council providing some more evidence, we did say we'd send a letter much quicker on that, explaining what we needed from the council in terms of evidence. The other letter will take a little bit longer in terms of covering all these other matters that we're picking up, and we'll deal with in a sort of interim findings kind of way. Okay. Move on to question 5, which is whether SP2 should define the scale and settlement, the scale of development expected in the various urban locations and rural settlements. So what I picked up from reading lots of the statements is that many representatives argue that it should be set out clearly. That seems to be the main thrust of it. I don't think anybody was particularly arguing that this shouldn't be. I might be wrong. The council's position is that that's not necessary, but they would do it as a main modification if Mr. Dillon and I thought it was necessary. Is that a fair summary of?
Yes, that is a fair summary of our response. Yeah.
So I'm not sure we need any discussion particularly on that, because it is it's sort of two-way split, isn't it? And it's really for Mr. Dillon and I to go and have a think about it. We've read people's reps. Is there anything anybody particularly wants to have the right to be heard on this particular question? No? Okay, I think we've probably got better things to discuss that are got more meaty substance. So the next question on the agenda, again, I think this relates to a small group of people that have made representation on this point. Whether SP2 should set out the need for C2 care homes and other specialist housing. So MPPF 62 says it should be assessed and reflected in planning policy. There's reference in DP1 and paragraph 4.37 to 4.42 to the specialist needs. Paragraph 440 says that the SHMAR identifies the need for 3,500 specialist older persons accommodation units and 2,500 units of residential care provision. So how, in terms of how the council ensure that it's provided really in larger developments set out in paragraph 4.41, I think is the sort of key point, is how to ensure that that's sort of followed through and it's not just reliant on developers providing that. And I think the other issue that came out as well is providing certainty for developers that if they know that we're expected within a certain allocation to provide this, presume there's cost issues to doing that. So if the council want to address that, and if there's any sort of residual points that people want to pick up, then we can take those. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. In the first instance, I just make a point that we don't reflect the importance of assessing and reflecting the needs of different groups within our communities. We very much consider that we've done that in this plan. In terms of the need for C2 and for specialist accommodation for other people, specifically reference DP1 itself. As I said earlier, it's important to have this policy deals specifically with residential mix. The first policy makes it very clear that the is expected to include an appropriate mix and specifically said it should include consideration for children, people wishing to build their homes, people with disability and special needs in accordance with our strategic housing market assessment. I was tempted to say SHMAR, but I use the full term. The specific ways of achieving particularly housing for people with needs. I think it's important to achieve for range of types of development. First and foremost, it's ensure the general is developed user-friendly. And we have specific requirements within the policy to ensure that the dwellings include specifically para which is seeking to ensure that people are able to remain independent for as long as possible. Having said that, we very much appreciate that the needs can be met on there. That's Title 6 of the policy, which deals with an appropriate to meet the needs of the people, the needs of those with disabilities on something so the policy is an expectation of our to include appropriate requirements to meet those needs. One before the deal is also important to recognise structure as well. So policies include positively improved the combination from within defined boundaries within the criteria of the community clusters. It's also important to recognise that rural developments will also extra care facilities appropriate forms of the combination within the countryside. We have to uptake and delivery of certain in Shrewsbury, for instance, there's a couple of various schemes in the town that a number of units deal with the simply recently being constructed, which I think shows the importance of the current approach and I think it's supporting that and ensuring that new developments those needs. So I think to ensure that those needs are met.
Thank you, Mr. Carden. Just have Mr. Shaw, do you want to?
Yes, thank you, ma'am. Richard Shaw, Savills Planning, on behalf of Senator Gura. In terms of a very simple answer to the question of whether SP2 should set out the need, I think the answer is yes. And the two key reasons for that are, firstly, the MPPF in para 61 and 62 requires that to be done. And since the revision of the PPG in July 2019, there is now quite extensive guidance for policymakers, which quite specifically points in the direction of explicitly providing for the range of requirements. In that PPG reference 010, it helpfully identifies 4 specialised accommodation types, ranging from age-restricted housing through retirement and sheltered living, both of which are C3 uses, to extra care homes and nursing homes, both C2. And there are guidelines in that for assessment methodologies and the needs of each sector being specifically identified. And so whilst I welcome the general references that Mr. Corden has referred to that are in the plan, the quote expectation, which is the word used, for those needs to be met by house builders as part of strategic urban extensions is unrealistic and unreliable. The policy needs to be more specific numerically across those 4 sectors that are defined in PPG. A couple of quotes from PPG under a subheading of that ID 63. Why is it important to plan for housing needs for older people? It specifically says the need to provide housing for older people is critical. And that's unusual. That term critical is actually, it's not matched anywhere else in housing or other guidance. The government is quite clear in specifying that we have a crisis in this country of a burgeoning ageing population, and as you've probably seen from the local plan, Shropshire has a higher proportion of its population in the older categories, and that proportion is increasing faster than the national average. And so this is a key issue for Shropshire. guidance very clearly talks about providing a choice of accommodation to suit the changing needs of people, enabling them to live independently for longer. And that does need to be set out, in our view, quite specifically in the plan. Drawing upon examples from elsewhere, there are examples of other plans very recently being required by inspectors following examinations to have a specific policy. And we can, if it helps, provide Mr. West and Mr. Corden with some examples of other authorities where that's been done very recently and the reasoning set out for that. I'm happy to do that in a note between now and when we come to the specific site allocations. But generally what we feel should be provided is either a criteria-based policy in addition to the windfall arrangements that Mr. Corden mentioned, or to consider site-specific allocations for large retirement care and other specific healthcare villages, because that is a form of development which is being promoted by the industry in response to that specific need at the moment, and it's a very effective way of meeting those needs. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just take Mr. Thomas because I think we're presumably saying similar things, and then I'll allow you to come back. That's okay.
Thank you, Mrs. Crosby. Stuart Thomas from Bury, speaking in this context on behalf of Morris Property. I'd just like to add to what Mr. Shaw has said, if I may, and likewise would firmly agree that the policy should set out a specific need for C2 care home provision, and the reasons for that lie so within the Council's own evidence. So if we were to look at policy DP1 and the supporting text within that, there are two telling bits of evidence that would lead us to that point. The first is, and this is in para 4.20, it basically states that households with a household reference person aged 65 to 84 years are projected to increase by 42.8%. And then the second factor set out in subsection B is that households with an elderly household reference person 85 years and over are projected to increase significantly by 130%, more than doubling in size from 6,900 households in 2016 to 15,900 in 2038. So some quite substantial figures there. If you look at those figures in the context of the site allocations, the local plan itself identifies 36 of the total 76 allocations that will be over 50 dwellings in size. Of those, 20 allocations are for up to a maximum of 100 dwellings, or I should say indicate 100 dwellings. And therefore, in our opinion, that's unlikely to make any significant provision for specialist accommodation amongst a normal mix of 2, 3, 4 and 5 bed properties when you consider that against those percentages and evidence that the council have put forward. So it's against that context that we believe that yes, it's absolutely critical that policy SP2 does set a positive approach to that provision. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to speak on this matter before I bring the council back? No? Okay. So, Mr. Corden?
Yes, thank you very much, Mrs. Crosby. This is quite a big point there, so I'll deal with please forgive me. The first point is I agree that it suggests there's a requirement to include a report. It specifically indicates the need to reflect on the issues in the plan. When we refer to specifically says indicative figures of need for of units of specialist housing for people needed across it doesn't suggest there's a requirement to do so. And we feel the strategy and policy is effective at meeting those needs. And the needs are specifically recommendations to DP1. That's justification for that. With due in paragraph 13. We want to create inclusive communities, and we feel groups specific uses. Just down the road, sustainable urban expansion, and it includes open housing for similarly down the sites coming forward specialist sites as mix of uses proposed. Just about reasons to deliver specialist through I think I potential for secondary sites where the complementary for the use. So there's a range of opportunities to deliver specialist accommodation from considered providing a strategy for achieving meeting those needs.
Thank you, Mr. Carden. So we'll move on now to the next question. So everybody's had their say on question 6. So question 7 is whether the way settlements were clustered, so the system as a community hub or community cluster are consistent, fair and objective, and whether the assessments were based on up-to-date data about services. So there's been quite a significant number of representations on this matter. Generally, obviously, and they were concerned about the scoring. I don't intend today to look at specific scoring for different places. I think that's not our role in this examination. The main thing we need to concern ourselves with is whether what the council has done is fair and open and objective. I understand that there has been a process where parish councils or local people have come to the council and said they've not been happy with it, and the council have undertaken a kind of review, a double check to a sense check to make sure that what they've done is correct. Is that fair? Do you want to say anything else on it before we open it up?
I think only to say, Inspector Crosby, and thank you for that sort of opening, is that is correct. Obviously, we provided a methodology quite early on in the plan making process. It's a methodology specifically designed to be consistently applied across the board. In answering your question on that respect, and objective in that respect as well. Clearly there have been, Shropshire's a big place with a lot of rural areas and a lot of villages, as I'm sure you're clearly aware, and inevitably that process has led on to some communities questioning their scoring, the ability to access services, and we have gone through a process of checking that as well. So where we are at the moment, I think, is our most up-to-date position. Obviously, we'd be happy to have a conversation through this process if you wanted to about that, but we're sort of in your hands about that. But in answer to your question, yes, a consistent and objective process completely is our view on that.
Yeah, and as I understand it, people have come to you, had a look and had a sort of sense check, made sure what your data, because there were some concerns that the data you was working on was maybe out of date or things had closed down since, that sort of thing.
to introduce the issue, we introduced the methodology of the issues and strategic options. We then adopted the methodology for consideration of consultation responses, support the documents done by the council, subject to consultation the distribution of the including the implications for settlements in terms of who was going to be identified as a community hub. We, as part of that consultation, we sought to use our communities as to whether the scope was correct. We consulted at the and communities felt that the scope was correct. They were able to provide responses to that consultation for issues. We reflect the acceptance as we considered appropriate. Has resulted in the 2020 version of the hierarchy settlement, which is the most recent iteration. The communities have had opportunities to raise their concerns where we felt it was appropriate to respond to them. We've updated the assessment accordingly.
Thank you, Mr. Collin, that's helpful. Is there anybody who wants to speak on this? Mr. Shaw, is that from before? That's okay. I'll just look round. Mr. Green, I think, is the first one.
Yes, thank you. Just a brief point. First, just say I'm Charles Green, representing CPRE, the Countryside Charity Campaign to Protect Rural England. Just a point in our Regulation 19 submission, paragraph 68, that I think the scoring system is objective, and there are, as you say, there are some communities who disagree with it, but if a different scoring system was used, much the same result would result. But there are the problems around the edges, and we said that the balance of evidence we set out would indicate that some proposed hub villages do not satisfy the council's own internal definition of sustainability. I think the whole thrust of the hierarchy of settlements scoring system is to identify sustainable villages. So we concluded that some of that scoring resulted in identifying hub villages that didn't satisfy the council's own internal definition of sustainability, and the ones we identified were Ditton Priors, Cross Houses, Wore, Stroke Islands, Floss and Nuckin. I say that's paragraph 568 of our Regulation 19 submission, and there was also doubt about Clun, Hinstock, Cosford and Trevollen. Just that brief point, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'll bring Mr. Roberts in, and then, because I suspect the comments might be quite similar, so we'll deal with that one. Mr. Roberts.
Thank you. There are a couple more people that I'm sure putting their little signs up to speak after me, and I'll try not to spoil their thunder. First of all, to say that the idea of the point system is, in our view, a big improvement on the previous system, because several settlements actually lost sustainability in that system because they weren't being fed by development.
Yeah, it becomes a catch-22 to some degree, doesn't it?
Indeed. What I wanted to do was to illustrate the situation that we've got now with the point system, with a couple of examples, not to get into the detail of their points, but the two I was going to draw your attention to were one, Longdon, which is just to the west of Shrewsbury, and number two, Cockshut, which is to the north of Shrewsbury. In the first version of the hierarchy of settlements, Cockshut was identified as a community hub. In the second, most recent hierarchy, because in the meantime it lost its shop, it's now a community cluster. The opposite happened with Longdon, where it was part of a community cluster in the old Sandev, and because of the nature of the scoring that went on, it's now a community hub. Now, the difference between those two villages is that Cockshott has got about 2.5 times the population of Longdon. And some of the facilities that the council have scored quite highly for Longdon, for instance, a library, you'll hear about this from others, I'm sure, library and village shop, receive full points, which tip them over the bar where a community hub kicks in. Now, in the earlier version of this hierarchy, there was almost a clear division of point scoring because there was a gap of about 3 points between where they cut off the community hubs and you became a community cluster. In the present version, there's no cut-off, there's no gap between those 2 points. And so we've now got Longdon with about 350 people there, suddenly becoming a hub and therefore attracting a development boundary and therefore attracting an estimated settlement value, number of houses, whereas Cockshott has gone in the opposite direction with 850 houses and yet has suddenly been faced with no more development and no development boundary. And it seems to me that the point system is a really good starting point, but then there should have been some questions about how did the changes occur. What were the reasons that some villages have lost services, other villages have gained them, and what can then be done to increase the sustainability of those that have lost? And so that's an extra stage, I know, and that's where it's less objective because points are, once you start adding things up, you say, oh, that's very objective, but it doesn't answer the question. And the object of the exercise is to increase sustainability. And I know that puts development into rural areas, and we've heard that that shouldn't happen, but the object of the exercise is to increase sustainability, and then you cut down on the amount of travelling that people do. And that's exactly what's happened to Cockshott. People now have to travel out of Cockshott to get their services, to get their shopping. And at Longdon, it's resulted in an allocation of 50 houses, which will never be able to be accommodated within the development boundary. Quite impossible. And yet there's another policy in the document which says that if villages fail to meet the target, the housing target within their development boundaries, will go outside. Now, Longdon has had a lot of problems over the past few years with development being proposed outside the village. It didn't have a development boundary before. It was part of a cluster and had no development boundary. Nevertheless, it attracted, 3, 4, 5 even planning applications for substantial estates around its boundary, which in fact were supported by the local authority officers, happily got refused by the various committees it went to, and all those were upheld, i.e. dismissed, on appeal. But they can see, I think, and I think you'll hear from the two people that are from Longdon, that they're concerned that once that development boundary goes in with an amount of housing that cannot be accommodated, they're going to be back into the same scenarios that they were with a few years ago, but this time there's going to be the backing of a policy which says that you can develop outside development boundaries. So it requires a little more thought than just dealing with a set of figures.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts. I'll come to Councillor Dennis and then Mr. Lovegrove. So I'll take all the comments together because I think they're probably quite similar. Mr. Carter, so Councillor Dennis. If I could just remind you not to keep repeating things that somebody else has already said, because we've obviously only got so much time and the council will respond to points. Mr. Dennis.
Right. I'll try and keep it succinct, but I suppose when it comes to the issue of fairness and the objective evidence, that's what we're interested in. I have an enormous amount of sympathy for the council in what they're trying to achieve through the hierarchy of settlements and identifying what's a significant rural service centre. But it's always going to be on the margins that the issues arise. And I think what we would want, I'm representing Clive Parish Council. I'm one of the councillors. And what we would want is that the evidence is based on what is actually on the ground, that it's objective and that it's up to date and that it's accurate, but also that the methodology has been applied consistently. And I think those are the two issues that we have particular concerns with. By nature, I have to go into a couple of specifics about our experience because that things on the ground aren't actually there. So at the moment, Shropshire Council is relying on two amenities that we would say we don't have to give us our classification as a community hub. So one of which is a bowling green. I'm sure you're going to hear about the bowling green in many different ways, shapes and forms. And it almost feels as if it's an existential question now, as when is a bowling green a lawn? I mean, the village's view is we don't have a bowling green because it was shut in 2018. No bowling has taken place in there for over 4 years. There's no public right of access to it. And it doesn't appear in Shropshire Council's own playing pitch and outdoor sports strategy from 2020. And so whenever we bring this topic up with the council, we're met with the response that it's in your open space needs assessment, which although superficially looks from 2017, actually dates from 2009. And so we keep running into this buffer of, because this one document based on site settlements, site visits from 2009, we're continuing to say that you have a bowling green simply because no one's asked to build on it. So for planning purposes, it still might be a bowling green, but is it an outdoor amenity sports facility? I think all of the village would say no. And that hence the 45 plus objections that went into the Regulation 19. And we've been having this conversation with Shropshire Council since 2018. And actually at one point they did agree with us, which is why it went slightly quiet. And we have the written evidence in which they said, yeah, we agree you don't have a bowling green and we'll reduce your points. So we thought that the issue was done and dusted. So we were rather perturbed when it came back again at the regulation 2018 hearings. So it just doesn't feel as if it's fair or reflecting what is objectively on the ground. And it doesn't feel as if we're being told consistent things by the council, so that we're told one thing and then only at a later round of consultation is another issue brought up. And I think this is also illustrated in our response to the Regulation 19, which the council said, well, okay, even if you don't have a bowling green, we'll include Renshaw, we'll say you've got Renshaw's Field as an outdoor sports facility. I mean, this is a field, you know, that there's no pitch on it. You know, it wouldn't meet a sort of a five-a-side requirements, and also it's already included within our hierarchy of settlements. So it feels as if I hesitate to use moving the goalposts considering where we are, but that's what it feels like. Is that each time we rebut an argument, the goalposts move on us, and so we're left at each application being pushed into something. A community hub status that we just feel is unjustified. And I think it's also about the consistency in the way things that other villages have, their experience of the hierarchy of settlements has been quite different. So our village shop was under threat from about 2015. It was up for sale because it was unprofitable. It was finally sort of shut in 2019, briefly reopened, but then closed permanently in 2020. And when other villages, their amenities closed down. They were simply required to inform Shropshire Council, and their points were adjusted accordingly. That's not been our experience of it, and we were asked to provide evidence of the financial unviability of the shop. We were asked to provide the details of the marketing with the estate agents as to why it hadn't sold for 5 years, and then we were asked to submit a change of planning application to prove that it wasn't going to reopen as a shop. Now, none of the other parish councils that we've spoken to when their amenities have shut have been asked to go to such onerous lengths to demonstrate the loss of an amenity. So it doesn't feel to us as if this is being applied consistently across different settlements. That's been our experience of it, and I recognise it's quite niche. We're just we are one small village in what's obviously a much bigger plan. But from our point of view, it does call into question, is the hierarchy of settlements actually based on up-to-date and accurate information? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dennis. I can't see the name, please. Is it Mr. Carter, is it? Mr. Carter, yeah.
Try that one. Paul Carter, London Parish Council. I just want to add a couple of 3 points to that good speech we've had the last two speakers. First of all, we don't think it's fair. It asks for it to be fair. It doesn't seem to be fair. We have the same number of points for a library bus that comes 10 minutes once every 2 weeks as another village which has a fully staffed library. How on earth can that be fair? We have a shop and a post office, but it's about as big as the reception area downstairs. You can get one person in, and that's given the same number of points as a village with half a dozen shops, supermarkets, this, that and the other. It doesn't seem at all fair, and we've tried to get things changed, and it hasn't worked. Clive's alluded to our developments, or lack of development, fighting against large build sites on the outskirts of the village, and we're really concerned that this is going to take us back 5 years. We're really upset about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carter. Ms. Lovegrove. Group. I echo what Paul Carter and Clive Roberts has said, but I think what has been missed out from the submission that was put by the parish council, that there have been alterations in that the shop had to move to become more sustainable, and has moved into half of the already depleted Tankerville Arms pub, which has benefited the pub and also the shop, and they work reciprocally because there is now a little bit more car parking area. But the post office organisation took it on board that this was a good reason to close the post office because it was relocating, and because of the hue and cry of the residents of Longden and Longden Parish, we have now a itinerant post office which comes for 1.5 hours twice a week. If there isn't a bank holiday, in which case then it's only one visit. And that is literally set up in the bar of the pub. But we're still given the same amount of points for a post office as, say, Ponsbury. The other thing that really needs to be marked down is the fact that the road infrastructure, Longden is served by the C150, which is in many places a single carriageway road with passing places, which runs between Bishop's Castle and Shrewsbury. It is crossed by various other lanes which have far fewer passing places. So, literally 2 Land Rovers could not pass each other on these roads. And there is no employment in Longden
apart from agriculture. A local farm worker had permission to, it was a local needs dwelling. However, the water wasn't sufficient, the water supply, mains water supply wasn't sufficient, and nor were the mains drains. So he's had to, purely because it was an agricultural worker's cottage, he has managed to sink a borehole, or the farmer has sunk a borehole, and also put in a septic tank. But, you know, it's not sustainable. That's really all I've got to say. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Was it Mr.
Yes, Mr. Andrew from Trevone Rural Protection Group, but more sort of commenting more on the wider picture about the hierarchy of strategies. You know, various people have advised of errors, and we've notified the council at each stage of the hierarchy of settlements about known inaccuracies in the Table 10 scorings. And these are not about the double scoring issues about shops and services and post offices being combined, but just factual errors that we believe should have been corrected and checked to get an accurate and true comparison between settlements. Some of the current established hubs were showing no employment, but from our research they had got them. Obviously the council had a vast list of settlements to judge initially and relied on Mint database outside sourcing for some of the information, but we feel that they should have then researched, especially when inaccuracies were notified, you know, gone and checked on things, and that maybe has influenced the scoring and the comparison of sustainable settlements, because that table has formed the judgment of the officers, and there's been mention of a 3-point gap, which was initially stated as being the place to put the lower hub threshold between them and other rural. But it was shown that when the scoring was corrected, there was no gap existing in the table. But that's obviously influenced the officer's opinion. In our view, that's influenced the officer's opinion about where that threshold should arrive at, rather than an assessment of the differences and similarities between settlements, rather than just the score. But the scoring should give an objective solution if it was accurate. But also then, there seems to be no way of adjusting that score, that we have arrived at a settlement list within SB2 that seems to be set in stone for the next 16 years, as opposed to there seems no process within the policy document in the plan to say how a settlement sustainability would be addressed if, say, a shop closed the week after the plan had been adopted. How would it still be a hub for the rest of the duration, even though its sustainability was now questionable? So it's the process, there's no method or note of how going forward on a day-by-day future that how that sustainability will be assessed. Referring to Tuesday's hearing, there was discussions about the sustainability appraisal on climate change, about private car use and the impact that it had in rural areas, the necessity for it, and it being a key contributor to carbon emissions, with travel to work being a main reason. And the council obviously asserting that consideration of climate change was running through the whole of their plan. But we feel in the hierarchy of settlements, there was wording included within para 541, where there was a
an exception sort of accommodated or proposed where there was not significant employment and regular public transport, that other services could compensate for a village not having those. But we feel that that's contrary to the climate change aims, because if there isn't employment and isn't public transport, the village can't be sustainable, and it's also going to be contrary to the carbon change aims of the plan. We don't see how things like a playground or even the shop can compensate for somebody having to travel to work, and that those key factors of employment and public transport really are key factors for the sustainability for a settlement being described as a hub. And the SANDEV inspector, moving on slightly to subjectivity and objectivity, obviously the SANDEV inspector's report of October 2015 raised concerns about the designation of hubs and clusters under the SANDEV, which was related to the option at that time for parish councils to opt in or opt out of hub status, and the requirement. And to overcome that, as I understand it, there was part of the reason for this early local plan review, partial review, because that was a subjective view of parish councils, and they wanted it to become a more objective, which was the aim of the hierarchy of settlements. But we've introduced, we believe that a more subjective decision has been brought back in by that wording in paragraph 541, where it just says a larger range of services might compensate for the lack of public transport and employment within the village, and that larger range is not defined, and it will become very subjective about what that larger range is and which of the services might compensate. So we believe that that wording within 541 should be removed to make the plan sound.
Thank you, Mr. Andrew.
Okay.
I'll come back to the council, particularly some of the points have already been addressed. I think one of the points somebody's made is about it not being nuanced enough, I suppose, is what they were saying, some of the scoring, and interesting about the review. So, is this set in stone until 2038, or will it be reviewed as part of a 5-year review, or whatever that's?
Okay, yeah. I'll start with Mr. Andrews' point and work backwards, because that's the way my brain works, unfortunately, if it works. But just picking up on your point there about the review mechanism, obviously we discussed a bit about that yesterday. Obviously, this is part of a development plan. If a village was identified as a community hub within this development plan, it would only be changed on the review of a development plan, but it could be changed on that review, subject to any further methodology we would employ at that local plan review. It might well be we seek to employ the same methodology. It might be that we seek it's appropriate to look at our approach and refine our approach, but that's one for later. But in terms of the overall view, it could be reviewed through a 5-year plan review cycle, so it's not set for 16 years necessarily. Just in terms of I'm conscious of time, but in terms of the points, there seems to be some disagreement between a few of the speakers around objectiveness and or otherwise of our proposal. I would say, just in response to that, there is planning judgment applied here, and the planning judgment is applied in terms of the specific nature of the settlement's strategies once the community hubs have been looked at in terms of the methodology. So the methodology is objective, but the planning judgment bit comes in about how that is applied to translating that into a sustainable approach within individual settlements. And you will see from the plan, so appendix, and it's number 5, appendix 5. Sorry, not 5, it's appendix. It is appendix 5, excuse me, which sets out our approach to hubs and the localised housing requirement. Within those hubs, you will see that it's quite wide-ranging in terms of that, and that has clearly taken into account local characteristics, particularly around population size and the level of services within those areas. So we obviously need to be evidence-based and objective, and we feel as though we are, but we also realise we are planners with some subjective judgment and professional judgment, and that's applied within that approach, the sort of second part of that approach in defining the settlement plan effectively for that. Did you want to come in? What was the other question you had, Inspector Crosby, specifically?
One about review, and the other was, one of the comments was about there not being nuance enough, so whether you had 1 shop or 5 shops, it was given a point for shops, so I think that was the sort of general point.
I'll refer to Mr. Thank you. It's a bit we've had this debate in the past. There should be a qualitative element to the assessment, and the point we've always made is, what is it based on the size of the unit, how well it's used by the community, how well it serves the wider used within the community, the range of products within it, the range of services. It's different people have different views on that. Subjectivity aspect should be related to. We ultimately didn't feel it was appropriate to do so. With the multiple provision, there was specific. The study presented there's multiple provision of specific services in response to that. The supermarket, the local convenience store, that was raised as one specific example. They can get different scores within the hierarchy. That comes back to the subjective view on the level of provision of the mobile service. We think it's a fantastic scheme for local communities. It will allow the ability for rural communities to engage with their and effectively. And I think that's important in a county like Shropshire, which sounds where communities are. It's a real benefit for that community. It's reflected in our assessments.
Thank you, Mr. Corden. So it's obviously time to break for lunch. It's 12:35. Just a couple of points. One, I'm wondering whether we can manage with slightly less than an hour, given that where we're up to in the agenda. Does that give anybody any problems? Feel free to say if you think you can't. I was thinking sort of 45 minutes. Does that allow people enough time to? I mean, if people are not, that's fine. So if you get stuck in some traffic jam trying to buy a sandwich or whatever, then we won't start without you. But if everybody can be back quite as quickly as possible, that would be good. And secondly, I'm conscious that some people might just come for items that we've already discussed. If you don't want to come back after lunch, that's absolutely fine. The programme officer's asked that you put your nameplate on her desk so she can, we've got to swap over at some point into the afternoon session, and it makes it easier for her if many nameplates are back, if people have left, so she knows who's left. And when we come to swap over at the relevant point this afternoon, it's clearly not going to be lunchtime when we swap to the afternoon session of people. I think what they've asked is everybody clears away from the desk so they can reset them completely. It's really hard to try and reset them places when people are sat at the desk with all their things around them, but we'll come to that when it comes to that changeover point. So it's 12:36 now, so if we break until 1:20, and hopefully that'll give everybody enough time to grab a sandwich. Thank you.